Well, I'd like to just begin by introducing myself, Adèle Perry Ndishnakas, Gawin Nidudimsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganash Kwe Ninda, Ogamakwe Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. My name's Adèle Perry. I don't know my clan. I'm a settler and a non-Indigenous woman, and I'm also the director for the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. And it is my honor to begin the latest in a series of online versions of the Center's longstanding Critical Conversation series. And I will let you know that we are recording this for posterity and for the use of those who are not able to join us in person. This particular event engages one of the four main themes of the Center for Human Rights Research, which is the relationship, often very contested relationship, between history, between human rights and commemoration. We do so digitally and online, but still very much rooted in this particular place, which is the territories of the Anishinaabe, the Innuwak, and the Métis people, governed by the agreements of Treaty 1 and also of the Manitoba Act. Almost a year ago, in early April 2000, Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister announced that the planned celebration marking 150 years since Manitoba became a Canadian province would be, and I quote, rescheduled. Amid the very early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, at that point, a long way away from the province's, by all accounts, disastrous second wave, the Premier explained that it was, quote, not the right time for a celebration. This particular disruption prompts us to look at the many other disruptions that have occurred in the history of this place, which often sits uneasily and awkwardly amidst celebratory accounts of Canada and its histories. 2017 made clear that national celebrations can become opportunities for critical and creative conversations. 50 or 100 years from now, what will be remembered about the marking of 150 years since the British North America Act or Confederation will, I think, be the ways that Indigenous and allied scholars, artists, and activists change the conversation about Canada, its past, and its present. In the case of Manitoba 150, the disruption was built in right from the start. How might we use this as an opportunity to further the critical conversation about the history of Manitowakiw, this place, in a way that doesn't paper over the complicated histories of colonialism, the moments of violence, displacements, loss, and division, as well as those of creation, beauty, solidarity, and possibility. These are all things that have marked our past just as they shape our present. We are extraordinarily lucky to have four really enormously accomplished speakers to help us begin this conversation today, and I'm going to introduce them to the gang in alphabetical order. They're each then going to speak for about 5 minutes each. We're going to have a conversation amongst the panel, and then we're going to open it up to our illustrious community that have joined us online, and we'll take questions via chat. But I'll begin with introducing Aimée Craft, who is a lawyer, author, and scholar. She teaches at the University of Ottawa and is the author of, amongst other things, Breathing New Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, an Anishinaabe understanding of Treaty 1. She is also co-lead of the Decolonizing Water project. Next, we have Farrell Racette, who is a historian, a practicing artist, a curator, and a whole lot more. She teaches at the University of Regina in the Visual Arts Department and is the co-curator of the Kwaatanihtowwakiw, or A Hard Birth, an exhibit marking 150 years of Indigenous history and creation in Manitoba at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which has now been rescheduled for 2022. Next, we have Erin Millions, who's a historian, a teacher, and a researcher. She is currently research director with Mary Jane Logan McCallum of the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis Photo Project. And she is also a member of the Welcoming Winnipeg Committee, which is a civic committee currently reviewing place names and historical markers in the city of Winnipeg. Our fourth speaker is Katherena Vermette, who is currently the writer in residence at the University of Manitoba Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture. She is widely known and loved for her poetry and fiction, including the Governor General Award-winning North End Love Songs, a book of poetry, and the best-selling novel, The Break. So we are incredibly pleased to have this really remarkable all-star panel with us today, and we will begin with Professor Kraft.
Oh, miigwech, bonjour, and nui maganeduk. Kiweden no dine Indishnakas, mekanaki Indishnakas, manganando dem. I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Really happy to be here on this bright sunny day. You can see the sun pouring in, there's a lot of it, and it's the place with the best internet and the most sun in my house. So thank you for the invitation to join into this conversation today. And I think that the opening remarks that you've made kind of center us in this idea of what is celebration and how do we do that, or how do we think about celebration as rememoration or memory, and thinking about how we can appropriate memory as something that can be transformative. And this is tied to some of the work that I'm doing with partners in Colombia and Uganda, and in thinking about this powerful ability of memory to be articulated in various different forms that helps us transform not only our feelings about past events, our knowledge about past events, but also create spaces for interaction in the future. And that's kind of what I want to suggest in terms of the disruption that I'm proposing in the face of rescheduling 150, and thinking about, when will we be able to come back together? And I think a lot of us hope that it will be this summer. And I'm going to propose that there's actually a very purposeful reason to have rescheduled the celebration or commemoration or remembering into 2021, which is the 150-year anniversary of Treaty 1. And so what I think this offers is an opportunity to rethink relationships within this territory. And if we recenter into this year and this coming summer, to think about the importance of the sharing treaty that was made in 1871 between the Anishinaabe and the treaty commissioners. And one of the things that, I've spent most of my lifetime arguing is that this treaty that was made was an agreement to share. And I think that's still fundamentally misunderstood. If I were to call the Premier and ask if we could reschedule the celebration to one of treaty, I'm sure I would be faced with a little bit of resistance on that front. But I do think it's the foundational relationship that allows settlers to be in this territory. And that needs to be remembered. If we even contemplate sort of rethinking or renegotiating treaties, we have to understand that without them, there's no legitimate settler presence in this territory. And that would place us back at square one, and there would be no 150 of a province to really celebrate without these agreements to interact in space with Indigenous people. So I was doing the math this morning, and 8 years ago, I put forward a book called Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty. And Adèle, when you introduced it, you said breathing new life into the Stone Fort Treaty. And I love that. Actually, these purposeful mistakes that we make, breathing new life, I think is actually where we're at with this point in time, and rethinking what those relationships can and should look like within our territory. And so 8 years ago, that was the suggestion, is to breathe some new life into the treaty relationship. Now, more recently, I think it's last week actually, I published this little book, and it's a book for young people called Treaty Words. And what it's getting at, it's actually not just for young people, it's for all people. And I hope that people will read it together in spaces and have discussions about the book itself. But the story is, I think, a beautiful one of a young girl and her grandfather that journey through this, coming to understand their place within all of creation. And ultimately what the story is trying to ask people to do, ask the main characters in the book, but also ask all people, is to think about being, very small and also very big within this relationship of creation, and understanding these very nuanced ways of sharing and interacting. So if we accept sort of Indigenous versions of treaties, we know that they're based on reciprocity, respect, and renewal at their core. And that's what this young girl and her grandfather are talking about as they listen to the river breaking up and they hear the geese coming back. It's exactly this time of year. And they're seeing all of these agreements and relationships of working together that are manifesting on the land. And so they take that up as being an original set of instructions or original treaties on which they understand the following treaties that are made with the Crown and settlers to be modeling in contemporary times. So these old, deep relationships that are made from, that are born from the land, the relationships between animals and birds and the sun and the water and the ice and the trees and everything that is in this cycle of renewal and respect and reciprocity is put forward as the way we should understand these relationships, these treaty relationships that were built thereafter. So, in bringing all of this together, I think my message today is that we have an opportunity and a rare opportunity to think back at the point where we're in this 7th generation after the making of treaty, to reflect on what is that agreement? What should it look like today, and how do we honor and respect it? And I think that there are some important questions that we have to ask in terms of how our society is structured, in terms of management and governance and decision-making regarding lands and territories, that needs to give effect to those original relationships that exist independently of humans, but also the treaty relationships that were created between humans and nations in order to live well within the territory. And I think that those conversations have to bring in concepts of governance and decision-making in accordance with Indigenous laws and legal orders, Indigenous forms of knowledge, and to look at one space that I think is critically important is in how we assess impacts on environment and how we make decisions in relation to environment in ways that reflect both original land treaties and the treaties that we've decided to make in regards to our human interactions on land. So that's what I wanted to share and contribute into the conversation today. And I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues speak about the amazing work they're doing and engaging in a conversation. Miigwech.
Well, thank you, Aimée, for really bringing to focus so many of the issues that this panel engages and kind of starting us off in a really remarkable way. I will now pass things over to Sherry Farrell Racette.
Hi, I'm coming at you from my kitchen. From my kitchen in Regina, Treaty 1, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Eastern Region 3, but before that, the homeland of the Buffalo Nation, because this is where they were in their millions. And everyone just picked their way very carefully around them, as we've seen from the archaeological record. I'm here to talk about my role in kind of rebooting and re-engaging and restarting an exhibition that started, and I'm just going to share my screen with a few images. So here we are, and here we are. You wouldn't know I do this every freaking day. So, whoops, here we are. My colleague usually does the Michif pronunciation, coached by Verna de Montigny. And now I can't see it. Yeah. I can't read the writing here. This is how bad I am. Kawahik, which simply means she had a hard birth. It was a hard birth. And it refers very viscerally to the act of a hard birth. And for those of us who've been mothers and some of us who've had a hard birth, we know, what that means. And because, we want to, I suppose, celebrate the accomplishments of the provisional government in 1869-70, recognize the role of the founders, but also we didn't want to gloss over the very real struggles and the long-lasting divisiveness, and also how short-lived that moment of success was, and to revisit that. So there's a couple of things about the exhibition, and there's a few misunderstandings of the exhibition. One, that it is a Métis exhibition, but of course the Métis are central to it. So I would say of the artists, of the work represented, you're looking at about 80% of a Métis presence in the exhibition, which reflects the percentage of the population at the time, 1869-70, which was Métis. So, and also when you look at the provisional government and their role, the provisional government also, I often have students who are quite surprised to find out that not everyone on the provisional government was Métis, that not everyone in the provisional government, even if they were Métis, necessarily were politically in line with Louis Riel, that there were enthusiastic discussions. And sometimes it's really interesting to look at what they were debating, and the presence of other languages and points of view in that very early discussion. But we want to recognize the central role of the Métis in the creation of Manitoba. We want to contextualize Louis Riel, because with all respect to Louis and his many relatives, many relatives in Manitoba, he was the son of the Métis nation, not the father of it. And many other important people, particularly women, get sidelined in conversation. So from a curatorial perspective, one of my considerations is to take a look at the role of women and to make sure that this isn't just a boys' conversation, that women were very present. And where we get women's voices is really in the material culture of the time, and also stories. Like I've found interviews with Métis women elders who talked about making moccasins for Riel, and who talk about him making gifts of food and supplies to their family during the difficulty. So, putting him in the context of a man in his community, and a young man. And when we look at the photographs, we don't always think that Riel was 25. Most of the older men, even though they look older with their haircuts and their beards, were in their 30s. Often they're misrepresented as being kind of a rabble-rousing crew, if you look at some of the histories. But really, there were three, for the lack of a better word, lawyers involved. Riel, Thomas Budd, who wrote the Constitution, Thomas Bunn, who wrote the Constitution, and James Ross, who was the first graduate from Osgoode Hall in Toronto. So we want to recreate impressions of the Red River settlement as a unique artistic and social space, and its unique material culture. And we want to acknowledge those difficulties and conflicts, and then recognize the loss of Saulteaux, Cree, and Métis land and economy that followed. Originally, it was supposed to open on May 30th. And when we got the opening dates, the new opening dates of February 5th, 2022, we were quite crestfallen. But the way things have unfolded, that's actually not bad. Because of course, at the time, we had no idea how many waves we were going to have, how hard hit our communities would be. And really, so much of our original programming was based on community engagement, the engagement of language speakers, the engagement of elders, and of course, we are more than happy to wait until we are safe to do that again. I've been involved as a curator and an artist in exhibitions where basically you have things in a room that nobody sees, and it's all on Instagram or some digital format. And our goal was to fill the WAG with laughing, arguing, storytelling, Métis people, and for people to really feel recognized and honored in this space. So some of the practical considerations of the delay has been that we have to renegotiate our loan agreements. The shutdowns across the country have impacted every gallery, every public space in the country. There have been some places we were organizing loans for where now we're all jockeying for the same artwork, as other exhibitions have all been bumped. So that's all had to be negotiated. We've also had some of our sister cultural organizations that have been devastated economically by the pandemic and had massive layoffs. So in some cases, people that I was in correspondence with around borrowing certain objects basically aren't there anymore, and whole departments have been shut down. So we've been very encouraged about the number of loan agreements that we've been able to maintain and reboot. We still get the same space, which is 2 large galleries and a separate space for community programming. So we will have a whole separate space where people can engage with each other. We are in a process of renewing and restarting our conversations with the Louis Riel Institute and the MMF, and because we had many plans in the works with the MMF 150 committee. We are going to be having circles within, as well as the community space. And so I just want to peek here. So this is just a sneak peek at what we're going to have. It's going to be awesome. It's still going to be awesome. Of course, there are going to be changes because COVID has affected everybody financially, and monies that were available, but not surprisingly not available for anything that's centered Métis people. But what you have on the left is one of our major commissions, new commissions, which is this iconic photograph of the newly elected Riel with the executive of the provisional government. Is going to be in a very large format in the gallery, and Janine Crouchy, who's, you know, everyone from Manitoba will know is one of the best beaters in, well, maybe the world, but certainly in terms of classic Métis style, she is the bomb. And so she's been working with a very strong vision for creating a beaded picture frame, which will be grounded in tradition, but incorporate some nuanced commentary from an artist from the committee, from the community. We're going to include significant documents. So we were in the process of borrowing the test roll with Louis Riel's signature when he's zipped into the House of Commons. We are also in conversations with the Manitoba Archives, Provincial Archives of Manitoba, to get the Upper Fort Garry account book that has pages with the heading "Taken by Riel and Company by Force," in which you have the names of all the men who were issued supplies. And I've already transcribed all those names so that for community members, we'll also change the page that it's open to throughout the exhibition, but we'll have in the community space information so people can see, you know, was great grandpa, you know, in Upper Fort Garry. We're going to have contemporary and historic arts. We have loans with the National Gallery of Canada, with the Canadian Museum of History, the Manitoba Museum, St. Boniface Museum, Parks Canada, so that we really get the best of Red River material culture so that people can really get their socks blown off by that. And we also have we'll have contemporary art. So the examples up here. So we have, you know, the Rindisbacher will be part of it. One of the things that we have been doing also is using the historic images, borrowing items from museum collections so that you'll actually see that sash pulled off that painting, that tiny painting, in the form of a sash from 1820 that's identical to that we're borrowing from the National Gallery of Canada. In the center is a set from Amanda Strong's Four Faces of the Moon, which will also be installed in the exhibition. So we had always intended to look at the aftermath and the struggles. Very often, this is one of my critiques of how even I have taught Métis history, we tend to chase Riel. we chase Riel from, Manitoba to Montana, then up to Saskatchewan, and that tends to be how we organize how we teach and talk about Métis history. But we're taking the time to focus on what happened to the people who stayed behind. And so this is Amanda Strong's grandmother and her experiences in Catholic school, this very persistent little person. And also the photographic works from the 1990s reflecting on growing up in Winnipeg in a biracial family by Rosalie Favell. So we have community-centered programming. We had a lot of things in the works that we still hope to be able to do. We hope to be able to have that laughing, that dancing, the music, and really welcome some of the historic material back, welcome it back, because a lot of this material that we're borrowing has been in drawers and it's coming home. So a big part of the opening will be a welcome home, an awakening up of these objects and these stories. We hope to be able to bring artists in for artist talks. We'll have film screenings, and we'll have small talking circles in front of certain works of art because they invite dialogue and questions. So that's it for me.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for that really powerful window into an exhibit that is going to be amazing and provide so many kind of points of reflection and points of departure, and I think shifts course in this conversation we're having. So thank you very much for that. I will now welcome to the digital stage Erin Millions.
Thanks, Adèle. I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. So when I was prepping to do this, this talk, I sort of thought about where I fit in with the other speakers. And then I wrote my talk, and then as I was finishing things up this morning, I realized that some of the things that I say repeat what Aimée have said, repeat what Sherry has talked about. So I'm going to think of that as excellent points of connection and move forward anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways that 2020 were disrupted, but also opportunities for commemoration in 2021 and moving forward. So in December 2019, the Manitoba 150 Committee hosted a kickoff. Sorry, I'm just going to minimize that. There we go. Hosted a kickoff for the upcoming year of commemoration on the grounds of the provincial legislature. This signaled what the official Manitoba 150 was going to look like: celebratory, centering narratives of progress and rural roots, and obscuring Indigenous histories of our province. My initial reaction was confirmed when Premier Brian Pallister issued an official statement on Manitoba 150, a statement which made no mention of Indigenous peoples, but lauded what Pallister called Manitoba's tolerant and inclusive society. Now, thankfully, counter narratives to this official commemoration were underway, like the MMF 150 and Sherry's exhibit, which I'm very excited to have my socks blown off. But like most of the anniversary events, they were postponed or canceled due to the pandemic. 2020 also marked another notable event in Canadian and Manitoba history, the 350th anniversary of the Hudson's Bay Company, Canada's longest existing commercial enterprise. The company was a colonial presence in Western Canada long before the country of Canada existed. The HBC looms large in Winnipeg's and Manitoba's histories in ways that are really unique to this place. The company negotiated early settler First Nations relations along the shores of the Hudson's Bay and completely ignored Indigenous land rights when it sold its territories to Canada. This triggered the Métis resistance of 1869 that forced Manitoba on Métis terms that acknowledged Métis land rights. Upper Fort Garry, the HBC headquarters for Rupert's Land, was the physical center of the resistance. And you see Upper Fort Garry in the photo on the left, sort of near the top of the screen there. And this is a Rindisbacher painting of the forks of the Assiniboine and Red River and Fort Garry. And you can see back here in the background is St. Boniface Cathedral in 1821. The company has also physically shaped Winnipeg's downtown landscape, which ensconces the former site of Upper Fort Garry, situated at the forks of the two rivers. It's no coincidence that two of our downtown main streets, Broadway Avenue and Main Street, border the former site of the fort. Long after the fort was dismantled in the 1880s, the HBC continues to mark the downtown today through the many streets named after fur trade officers and prominent Métis fur trade families. The HBC has continued to shape Winnipeg's landscape and Manitoba's history in the 20th century. The historic Bay Building department store was constructed in 1926 and operated as one of the Bay's flagship stores for 94 years. The HBC also continued to operate as a colonial enterprise in northern Manitoba long after the end of the fur trade in the South. And if you're interested more in that, you can look up the 1972 film, The Other Side of the Ledger, which was one of the first productions by the Indian film crew of the National Film Board of Canada. And that film tells the story of the 300th anniversary of the HBC from First Nations perspectives. Now that said, even though this was marking a fairly important or long moment of time in the company's history, 350 years, the anniversary has gone largely unnoticed by both Winnipeggers and Manitobans in general. It was marked primarily by the commodification of commemoration by the Bay itself. I like to call Barbie here Colonial Barbie. And by small virtual events that catered mostly to archivists and historians. And certainly some of these events, which would have been in person, were also disrupted by pandemic times. Indigenous histories are central to both Manitoba 150 and the HBC 350th. The Province of Manitoba and the HBC are both built on the exploitation of Indigenous resources and the purposeful why did I put a word in here I have trouble saying, obfuscation of First Nations and Métis land rights. The 2020 official commemorations were set to celebrate achievement, longevity, and the spoils of colonialism, while at the same time ignoring the Indigenous peoples and the colonial systems that were central to Manitoba and the HBC. So it's somewhat fitting that the tail end of these disrupted commemorations were marked by the abrupt and early closure of Winnipeg's downtown Bay Building in November 2020. And on the left there, you see the shuttered Bay Building with all the windows boarded over. Nope, I've lost my last slide. That's okay. 2021 has the potential to let us rethink commemoration in Manitoba in ways that prioritize the Indigenous roots of our histories. 2021, as Aimée talked about, marks the 150th anniversary of the signing of Treaty 1 at HBC Lower Fort Garry. And this offers us an opportunity to remind Manitobans once again of the histories that make us all treaty people. And we're going to be seeing these 150th commemorations of the numbered treaties coming up year by year by year for the next until 2027. In downtown Winnipeg, the future of the Shuttered Bay Building has come to public attention in ways that so far have not been encouraging. The Bay Building, like all HBC legacy holdings, was built with capital accumulated through the marginalization of Indigenous rights. The Bay Building is a physical reminder of the HBC's dubious relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. In 2021, let's reconfigure how Winnipeggers think about Indigenous history in Manitoba and urban Indigenous spaces, as well as histories in this city. Let's commemorate the end of an iconic colonial space, by returning the building to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in downtown Winnipeg to be used in ways that benefit those communities.
Thank you, Erin, for bringing it all together in all sorts of ways. And all of those connections were indeed excellent. They were excellent connections, and they're great to be made. And I'd like to now bring to the digital space our fourth speaker, Katherena Vermette.
Good. Okay, hi. I'm getting pop-ups all over my screen. I don't understand. Tantakia. I am hoping that was decent enough Michif. I am still learning. Kanshia Kia. I'm coming to from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. Happy to be here with all of these lovely faces, and I thoroughly enjoyed those talks, and I am super excited about getting my socks blown off by the exhibit, and also about Aimé's book, which I am only hearing about today. I'm very excited about that, and also thank you, Erin. We are all on the Welcoming Winnipeg committee together, and I haven't seen you talk yet, so that was nice. I'm happy to meet you here. I had originally wanted to talk about my graphic novel series. I'm about to release the last. I'm about to release the last incarnation of a graphic novel series I've been working on for absolute ever. Okay, it's only been 5 years. It just feels like forever. Called A Girl Called Echo, and in it, there's this young girl named Echo, and she's experiencing what a kind of a difference and some disruption in her life, and she kind of lives in a modern day world where she's obsessed with 90s music, like all 13-year-olds her age. And I'm just kidding. And she's just one of those quiet, beautiful creatures that sit at the back of the classrooms in their hoodie with their headphones on, and they are just reaping with power, as yet untouched power. But in it, in part of that power, Echo starts to learn her Métis heritage and her Métis history through a great history teacher by the name of Mr. B. And of course, like all great, young Métis kids, she starts having the ability to time travel. So it kind of follows the adventure of Echo, and I'm so excited to release the final book, because it really culminates this search for identity that she has, her cultural identity, and also it parallels her gender identity through her time at this school and her years, time traveling. And I'm super excited to have her story come to an end in this form. I'm sure she'll pop up in other ways. But as I feel I would touch upon the same kind of points as other people have mentioned, though presumably I am not a historian and I get everything wrong. So very much as I've been diving back into Métis history, I've been distracted by all the bright, shiny things, and as I do, because I'm a poet. So I thought, why not disrupt the disruption with poetry? Because the other thing I was thinking of is, as everyone was talking, is this poem that I wrote quite a few years ago now. And it is about the time that we are celebrating here, the 151, I guess, anniversary of this time now, of the resistance of 1869, 1870. And so this is my rendition of some of that. Again, not a historian. I always often get everything wrong. It's a poetic history. And it's called When L'Oreal Went Crazy. After the Red River Rebellion of 1869, L'Oreal went crazy. He ran off and hid in a bush along the Seine, a land that jutted out into the stream, a place everyone called Vermette's Point. Just a thick mass of thin trees next to a narrow slot of plowed land, meek farmhouse, a brief place, nondescript, but the prideful home of my great, great, great uncle and aunt. Riel stayed there a long month when spring spread out slowly and separating him from his crimes, I imagine my aunt left food for him at the bush's edge, bannock and lard on meat on an old tin plate, a meal for a dog or a rebel. A lot of quotation marks in this poem. Something he would have to hurry to so the foxes didn't get there first. Some say that's where Louis took the name David, where in his cold, hungry penance, God spoke to him and gave him his divine purpose and a middle name. When Louis Riel was hanged in 1885, my great-great-great uncle had no land. Manitoba became a province. Canadian surveyors came in, and Métis homesteads were dissected, bisected, halved, quartered, over and over again until nothing was left. Only a square to balance one foot on for only 1 second before they all fell over. Ottawa took it all by then. All those half-breed lands, ribbon lots not properly bought, were sold, and my ancestral uncle's home was pulled out from him like a rug. Rolled up from the river's edge all the way to the road and tucked under Canada's collective arm. Chucked on an eastbound train with all the other rugs, all the other rolled up land that became tidy cylindrical tokens, conquered presents to be presented to John A., nothing more than rolled up grass like pressed cigars he lit up and smoked till they were spent. Only white ash brushed off red coats and made nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That is one of my very favorite poems from that collection. So it was yet another moment where everything came together. And I'm also going to officially say that historians also get everything wrong in all sorts of ways. And the conversation about the past, about what it means in the present and what it means for how we live in the places we live in is one that is best approached from all possible angles. So I want to thank everybody for really those really remarkable contributions. I want to begin the conversation that's following these conversations by asking if any of our 4 panelists have questions for the others. And I suspect there might be a few here. There's been lots of points of connections raised throughout the conversation. Is there anybody that would like to bring a question to the others? Sherry, I see that you are not muted, so I'm taking that as a sign.
No, I was, but
Oh.
I was just laughing. I was thinking about when Aimée was talking about treaty, I was thinking about the archaeological findings at the Forks that supported the stories of these great kind of international meetings that imply older treaties. I mean, it was one of the things that people were so upset about, you know, with development at the Forks at the time, because it's such a rich archaeological site. Mm-hmm. Have you connected that like this? Like we always think about treaties as treaties with Canada, treaties with the Crown, but the treaties we made with each other.
Yeah, I think there's, and I argue this in my Breathing Life book, is, you know, the treaties that we make as humans are kind of the last in a very, very long series of treaties. Like there were treaties before there were humans, right, amongst animal and other nations. Then we make treaties with them. We made treaties amongst each other. So we were actually very skilled diplomats when we got to the point of making Treaty 1, for example. And I think that that's something very important to be remembered as we put interpretive lenses on what the meaning of treaty might be. So a state like Canada, which is basically a baby 4 years in when it makes Treaty 1 and sends a list of instructions, which then becomes the written version of a treaty, you know, it seems kind of nonsensical to think about that as our starting point of interpretation of what the relationship is supposed to mean. And, you know, one of the things that I'm very cautious about in saying is never that the treaties are signed. They're treaties that are made, and that's making over time. So not, you know, fixed points in time and building on previous treaties. that were made. So it would be very interesting, I think, to take the opportunity now at 150 to look at, you know, the treaties as sort of the young versions of what was put into place, what was set into motion thousands of years or millennia ago. I think that's, you know, that's a very interesting question that leads us to sort of the philosophical underpinning that I was, you know, that I was trying to bring into the conversation, which is, I don't know why we human center everything. And I love the work that you do, Sherry, and others, you know, Katherena, like how you actually place objects or scenery or spaces, and like you've done, Erin, you know, a building at the heart of an inquiry, and things that kind of pull out humans from being that center core and think about these other things that can help us think through, or even to build relationships. One of the things I have been thinking about significantly is how to translate this idea that the stone fort where Treaty 1 was made is actually a witness to the treaty negotiations and has a role to play now, 150 years later, as a witness. And what does it mean for the rocks that form that fort to then be witnesses? And I think that ties.
Were they witnesses to themselves? Because there's a story that was collected at Scanterbury that the first stories were told to a boy by a rock. You know, that the rock had seen everything. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'm already thinking how we can incorporate it into the exhibition.
I'd love to chat about that, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Because that idea of objects as witnesses is something that we've been thinking about, and we've chosen some of the objects because they are witnesses. And one of the things that we're in the process of borrowing is from the upper fort. And it's a beaded moccasin vamp that has disintegrated and basically was recovered from an archaeological dig with the flower pattern still in place. And when you look at the style and kind of where it was in the archaeological dig, it's not a huge leap to think of this object as a witness, yeah, to the events that we're recognizing. You know, that these stones, that the water, like all of these things are witnesses to the events that we're talking about.
And that makes them living, right? Yeah. So that creates different forms of relationships between us now and them, as sort of what I refer to as older siblings, right? Those with more knowledge and more lived experience that can teach us something important.
Yeah, exactly.
Erin, I'm wondering if you can maybe return to the unpromising possibilities of the downtown Bay building.
Geez.
I will take that up. And what are some of the conversations that have and maybe haven't happened? And maybe how can we breathe some life, to go back to Aimée's phrase, into that conversation?
Mm-hmm. So I have sort of only recently come to developing more of an interest in the future of the Bay building, and it was through Adèle and I both watching a virtual summit on the future of the Bay building that was hosted by Heritage Winnipeg, and it was not good. Most of these panelists were men. About half of them were from places outside of Winnipeg. There was no people of color on the panel at all, no Indigenous representation, and Winnipeg Heritage has since acknowledged that they did not go about that in the correct way. But I think that the discussions that happened during that forum and the presentations sort of outline two things. The first is that the HBC's connections to the Indigenous people of this province are being wholly sidelined in the discussions around the future of the Bay building. And the second was one of the things that was useful from the discussion was that all of the sort of buildings type people who were on the panel agreed that the Bay building can be renovated for the same cost or cheaper and with less environmental impact than building a new building there. So I think it offers an opportunity to think in the long term and carefully about Indigenous spaces and Indigenous histories, particularly in downtown Winnipeg. One of the things that we do on the Welcoming Winnipeg Committee is we're looking at ways to create safe spaces for Indigenous people in Winnipeg, but in downtown Winnipeg is some of the focus here. And what possibilities are there for that building to redefine Indigenous peoples' integration into downtown Winnipeg, or not integration, but to acknowledge their presence there as first, instead of being marginalized to some spaces in the downtown. And I think one of the key messages that needs to come out of that to make that happen is to acknowledge that, you know, the Bay is a capitalist enterprise. The money that it used to build that building came out of its relationships with Indigenous people and its exploitations of Indigenous land and land rights, and its, you know, unauthorized sale of all of Western Canada basically to Canada, and use that as a focal point, sort of, that, and you creating Indigenous space around that, in that building, around that building, to think through what to do with that building. Let's not just turn it into condos. I think we can find better things to do with it in that. And that's sort of in the long term. In the short term, let's use those boarded up windows to feature some Indigenous art that tells the story of Indigenous people's histories on this land with the HBC, so that it's not just this blank space for the next few years.
I just wanted to, while it's in my mind, as you were speaking, I just remembered that a colleague of mine wrote a poem about seeing his grandfather's face in the side of the building, like in the kind of shapes. And his grandfather was treated very badly after having worked for the Bay in northern Saskatchewan for all of his life and being a very loyal Bay man, and then being cast aside. And so then as he's walking downtown Winnipeg, he looks up and he sees his grandfather's face like in the building. So I'll send that to you.
Yeah.
Because it's exactly what you're talking about. And I'm sure there are many, many, many stories like that.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. So I do also have a question, and I'm going to start with Katherena's poem, because I also love that poem. I've taught that poem. I will teach it again. And one of the things I really love about that poem is it tells us parts of the history that we don't usually tell, even in Indigenous. Even when we're teaching that history from Indigenous centered place and using Indigenous authors, a lot of the visceral parts that you feel in that poem don't come into the histories. And then that connects to what Sherry was saying, and Sherry and I both sort of research Métis women, and we talk about women's roles a lot. And she talked about how they want to tell women's stories. What were the women doing in this exhibit? So if we take commemoration as an opportunity to center memory, how can we understand memories of Indigenous histories in this place differently, in ways that Sherry's exhibit is doing, in the way that the poem is doing, and the way that Aimée has talked about the stones at the fort? How can we understand these histories better, differently, more nuanced ways through commemoration?
I feel like I'm plugged, so I'm supposed to say something smart now. It's funny because, and this is what I was thinking of when I was producing the graphic novels. I remember one of my editors, and she doesn't come off well in the story, so I won't mention her name. And she was talking about how I wanted to tell this story from how a young person, a young Métis girl would see this story unfold. And we were talking about the Red River Resistance. Oh, look, there's the covers. Aren't they beautiful? Okay, I got to totally take a moment and plug Scott B. Henderson and Donovan Yasiuk. I always get his name wrong. The artist and colorist who really brought Echo alive. And this is my girl. This is Echo with all her power. And yeah, she's barely smiling in the last book, which really kind of centers her journey towards, you know, she's a thinker and she's getting to the happiness. But it was funny because when we were doing the second book, Red River Resistance, I really wanted to talk about Riel and the committees and the work that they were doing. I wanted to highlight the fact that, yes, not all of those people on those committees were Métis, but also they were definitely men. I really wanted to, I spent a lot of time hanging out with, in my brain, with Annie Bannatyne, whom I love. And I wrote a separate story about Annie because I think she is definitely a hero and an auntie to Louis Riel. I love what you said, Sherry, about Louis being the son. I'm also totally guilty of chasing Riel because I'm, you know, a little obsessed with him and love following how his story unfolds. But one of the things I really wanted to do is just center that experience. I wanted to show her at Echo as a young girl seeing this unfold and what she would notice. And what she would notice is that her people, the people who look like her, the people who she finds out are her ancestors, are being persecuted actively and aggressively and constantly. And one of the things that I was hearing from my editor was now in history writing, we're supposed to balance these stories, you know, like we're supposed to show both sides. So I was supposed to somehow, I don't know, include Wosley as a sympathetic character in some way. And I said, you know, what the fuck? And why would we do this after, you know, however many years, 150 years basically of telling this story from one side. Now suddenly we're finally getting the platform as Métis people to tell this story, and we have to share the platform with the people that have actually taken up all this space for the last 150 years. I think it's perfectly legitimate to tell a completely Métis version of this story and not worry about that balancing at all. In the Northwest Resistance, we did a little more because we were going over, I wanted to do an overview and kind of like these long cam shots of the battles because there were so many different insurrections involved in the Northwest Resistance. I did take some time to highlight the different players involved, wanting to show all of them. And again, all guys, but I wanted to show all of them, but I have no problem with not having to balance this narrative at all. I think that really we can spend the next 150 years or so just talking about Indigenous perspectives, and then maybe we can learn and get to a place where we can share that space. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to dominate that story and or have those stories dominated, have that option, I think.
Next time I see you, remind me to tell you the story of Madame Turande in 1885.
I'm totally going to geek out all over that exhibit, like just the ledgers. I love the ledgers and the archives, and I spent way too long on all the old crusty stuff. Yes, I love hearing the stories of the women. I was recently, I'm looking right now into Sarah Ballendin. Yeah, who is the woman who is the center of, she had this huge controversy, talk about gossip, and during the 1850s, I think. Fascinating woman, great story. But yeah, there's so many stories untold.
I was stalking her through the Scottish census records.
Oh, sweet.
I'm really creepy about that kind of stuff.
Carrie, I think I already have them.
I know where she was living, and
Well, thank
Thank
you for those really, really important interventions. We have about 10 minutes left, if I'm keeping an eye on the clock correctly, a little bit less, a little bit more. And I'm wondering if we can maybe take some questions from folks who have kindly joined us for their afternoon of edification and learning and thought and conversation. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe submit questions on the chat that you could raise for any of our 4 speakers today, for Aimée Craft, for Sherry Farrell Racette, for Erin Millions, and for Katherena Vermette.
while we're waiting, can I
Sure.
redeem myself?
Yes.
I texted my co-curator Kathy Métis
Mm-hmm.
and told her that I totally bombed pronouncing the Métis word. And she's like, I'm sure you did fine. I'm like, no. So she sent me a phonetic pronunciation.
Okay.
So kwaatanihtowwakiw,
Very good.
a hard birth. Thanks to Kathy.
Well, I also want to say, like, it's interesting, all of that, and I'll just jump in the ways to talk about in particular about centering women and women's experience, and the way that often those sorts of formative political moments are described in terms of birth, but to situate it as a hard birth, I think does very kind of different work and really does locate it within women's lives, within histories of the body, within histories of intimate relations that are not necessarily easy or always copacetic. So I think that's a really significant kind of move that you make there. We have a couple of questions here. First one, so just some nice comments. Somebody, Jocelyn Thorpe, tells us that it has made her nice to see and hear everybody. It's making her day, so thank you. Somebody would like to hear more about Annie and Sarah Ballendin. So I don't know if anybody of the Ballendin fangirl group that has developed here today wants to take that on. And somebody also wrote about a semantic between thinking and difference about the Red River resistance and rebellion and how that phrasing matters. And then we have another question about a movement about reparations here in Treaty 1 territory and how that speaks to questions of the Bay building. So I don't know if anybody wants to take any one of those particular questions on. Maybe we can start with the Ballendins, then move on to reparations, and then maybe move on to language. I don't know if anybody wants to begin with the Ballendins.
You gonna go, Katherena?
I can try. I wrote another graphic novel plugging called This Place, and which is a retelling of stories also published by Highwater Press. And in it, I wrote a little story called Annie of Red River. Annie Ballendin, or Annie McDermott Ballendin, was the daughter of a store owner. She married a store owner and operated the Story on Main Street in the starting in the 1850s, 1860s. And she very famously, and this is what the story center is about, she very famously horsewhipped Charles Marr in the middle of Main Street on shopping day, which is wonderful. Charles Marr, of course, was, the Eastern blowhard who pretended he was a really fabulous poet. And he had been a writer for the Globe in Toronto and wrote really disparaging comments about the women of Red River and how we are, basically uppity. And of questionable moral character. So of course, being the good auntie she was, Annie Ballendin pulled him out of her store by the nose and horsewhipped him by everyone, saying as she raised the horsewhip, "This is what happens when you disrespect the women of Red River," which I love. She was also a wonderful contributor to charity. She was one of she was a fundraiser for many causes at the time, because there was many There was a lot of famine and poor crops, and she was one of the principal fundraisers of the first hospital in Red River. A phenomenal woman, I think, and buried right at the Kildonan Cemetery. So she can be memorialized and appreciated with that beautiful stone. Yeah, that's my Ballantine.
Yeah,
Sarah
that's-
Ballantine was,
Oh, yeah.
I'll let someone else take that because I'm just learning about Sarah Ballantine.
I can't remember the name of the guy she was supposed to have had an affair with, but one of the things about those women is that they were often 20, 30 years younger than their husbands. And they were transported all over the country and then often left to their own devices for months, sometimes more than a year. And during that time, she was supposed to have had an affair. Now, who was it? Which one of you history geeks can tell me who it was? It was some dashing Métis guy, right? Like a
Yeah.
Métis clerk. So it was
Yeah.
probably much better looking. Whatever. I don't blame her. I'm on
No,
your
he was
sexist.
a captain.
Go for
He
it.
was
Oh, it's a
military.
Gotta do
captain,
what
a
a woman gotta
military
do.
guy. A military guy.
He was
That's
a
right.
military captain.
Oh, yes. Well, so, oh, right. That's the guy, because I'm thinking of somebody else. Anyways, she denied it, but the gossips got a hold of it because there was that tension between incoming British wives and Scottish wives and basically Métis women that occupied a social space that they thought they should just pass over. They were very resistant to sharing that social space with Métis women. And it ended up to be like a really sad story. It basically destroyed her life and her health. And her husband took her daughters to Scotland where they lived with their aunt. It kind of compromised, maybe. Like now I'm looking at who the daughters married and I'm thinking they probably could have married, like, because they were all very into upward mobility and who you would marry. She ended up married to the guy who was in charge of the post at Pembina, the daughter did. And I think the mom died in Scotland after they were reconciled as a family. But it was, yeah, it's a sad story. And she was a beautiful woman, really beautiful woman. These women were very beautiful. And I think that was one of the things also that triggered the kind of jealousy. Because I've been looking at another woman. Actually, I made an art piece for another woman. We've heard the phrase a bit of brown. I didn't realize that that wasn't a general term. That actually came right out of correspondence between George Simpson and another fur trader, and they had all these disparaging terms. They were talking about one woman who was married at 15. And when they were writing about her, she was 19 and had 4 kids. You know, it's just the punishing treatment that these women got is, yeah, really pause for reflection. And so when we think about people like Annie Bannatyne and Madame Turande, who are still have that fierceness, we know where that fierceness came from. They needed to have that fierceness.
So
I'm just going to share my screen quickly.
sure.
Oh, I lost.
Oh,
the
there it
correct
is.
No, it's
picture.
there. We see it.
Where is it? Yeah, but that's not the right picture. Anyways, this
Oh.
is the Ballendin family memorial stone in Edinburgh. So there on the bottom, it says it was erected by John Ballendin. There's the one aside, and these photos are courtesy of Krista Barkley, who took these photos when she was in Edinburgh. So the Ballendins and the Bannatynes are related, which is often really confusing. But John Ballendin's nephew married Annie Bannatyne. So it's all confusing. They're going back and forth sort of across the Atlantic and a few different places. But one of the things that I'm interested in is Métis women in particular, but families who went to Britain and never came home, and the ways that those histories are marked by graves and burial spaces in Britain. So there's like this physical memory, but also those histories have largely been written out of British history. And so that Ballendin stone there sort of speaks to those histories a little bit. Anyways, I thought if there was any Ballendin and Bannatyne relations watching, they might be interested in that.
I'll also just say that in the chat here, Amanda McLeod from the Manitoba Museum has noted that when they included Annie's story in the new Winnipeg Gallery at the Manitoba Museum, they used a silver hairpin case in the collection of hers. And Mary Horodisky has also drawn our attention to a play that was staged at the Royal MTC a few years ago about Sarah Ballendin, which has been, I guess, a topic of conversation in a range of different ways. So a couple of things, and then the other questions that came up that I kind of initially sort of returned to here had to do with questions of reparations, if there was any discussion of those questions that have come up in this particular context. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that.
I have to say I don't know. In terms of HBC relationships, as far as I know, there has never been any sort of reparations agreement or payments from the HBC to anybody. Similar to sort of the CPR. I'm welcome. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And I don't know about the Treaty 1 thing. What I've been wondering is there a larger plan for these 150 commemorations as they move across the prairies, or are they just going to be treated separately each year, which seems, locally rooted, but maybe not great in terms of funding and publicity and things like that. Maybe there's a bigger way we can think about that group of commemorations that's not just locally specific.
Aimée, is that something you could speak to about what's happening regarding the upcoming wave of anniversaries of treaty making?
I think Erin's right in the sense that a lot of it is very localized. And one of the things that I think is a big gap would be, Canada as a treaty partner actually stepping up with commemoration funds. If we look at the example of how much attention was paid to Canada 150 and the amount of money that was spent on that, why wouldn't there be, equal pockets of funding that would represent the treaty relationships, the historic treaty relationships that form this patchwork quilt over Western Canada? And I think that in itself, kind of ties to what I was getting at earlier in terms of different initiatives to renew relationships. And I think that land back is actually going to be a very important part of that ongoing conversation. I think you're alluding to it, Erin, in some ways, but a lot of it has been focused on Indigenous protected and conserved areas or guardians programs, and Canada kind of meeting its targets in terms of environmental and territorial protection, and a lot less on the urban spaces and what land back and ongoing land relationships might mean. And so reimagining sort of the urban land back movement in Western Canada and in relation to treaty anniversaries would probably be a very interesting way to bring together some of those ideas around the anniversaries of treaty making.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to note that there's been a couple more comments in the chat, including Katherena sharing with us the reminder that the way that usually in the historical records that particular issue with Sarah Ballendin is referred to as the Foss Peli scandal, named after Captain Foss. And it's a pretty classic way that actually the subjectivities of the women is written out of the main way that the historical events are described. And these are conversations that are putting those women and those lives and those histories, including of Métis women at Red River, but also of land and treaty and politics, of the Hudson's Bay Company and what it meant and didn't mean, back into the center of how we think about this place and what the past means to the present and how we live there. So that is a fitting place to draw this to a conclusion. I want to thank Justin Rasmussen from the Center for Human Rights Research for all of his work on this, and also thank Helen Falding for all of her work on this event and for all of the years at the center. She will be very much missed. And I want to thank our 4 extraordinarily illustrious and eloquent and sharp and big-hearted speakers for really bringing it today in what I think was a really remarkable panel that I really just felt honored to be a small part of. So thank you to everyone, and we will see you at events in the future. Thank you.